History is full of disasters, wars, famines, earthquakes, but nothing in the entire human record comes close to what happened in the autumn of 1347. This is the story of the Black Death. October 1347. A fleet of 12 ships pulled into the port of Messina on the eastern coast of Sicily. They had sailed from the Black Sea port of Caffa, carrying grain and goods along the ancient Mediterranean trade routes. It should have been a routine arrival. It was not. The crowds gathered on the docks were met with something they had never seen before. Most of the sailors aboard the ships were dead. The few still alive were draped across the decks, barely conscious, their bodies covered in strange, black swellings. Swellings the size of eggs, oozing blood and pus from the groin, the armpits, the neck. Their skin had darkened in places, almost as if it had been burned from the inside. The Sicilian authorities ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately. But it was already too late. Within days, the people of Messina began to fall ill with the same horrifying symptoms. Within weeks, the disease had spread to the mainland. Within months, it was consuming the entire continent of Europe. What had arrived on those 12 ships would go on to kill between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people, dead in less than 5 years. The people of the time called it many things: the Great Pestilence, the Great Mortality. The term we use today, the Black Death, would not become common until centuries later. But whatever name you give it, the meaning was the same. Death had arrived, and it had no intention of leaving quickly. To understand the Black Death, we need to travel back even further, back to the windswept steppes of Central Asia, nearly a decade before those ships arrived in Sicily. In the year 1338, something began killing people in a region near Lake Issyk-Kul, in what is today the country of Kyrgyzstan. Archaeological evidence, discovered only in recent decades, shows grave markers from that period bearing a haunting inscription. The cause of death, carved in stone, was listed simply as pestilence. This, as far as we can tell, is where the story begins. The disease was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It lived primarily in fleas, which in turn lived on rodents, particularly rats. In the vast grasslands of Central Asia, the bacterium had been circulating quietly among wild rodent populations for centuries, perhaps longer. It was, in a sense, waiting. What caused it to suddenly explode outward in the 1330s is still debated. Some historians point to climate shifts, which disrupted rodent populations and drove them closer to human settlements. Others point to the enormous network of trade routes that crisscrossed Asia at the time, particularly the Silk Road, the vast commercial highway that connected China in the east to the Mediterranean in the west. Whatever the trigger, the disease began to move. Slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. It reached the Crimea by 1346, and here, history records one of the most extraordinary acts of biological warfare ever documented. A Mongol military commander named Janibeg was laying siege to the Genoese trading port of Caffa on the coast of the Black Sea. His army, however, was being ravaged by the plague from within. Soldiers were dying faster than they could fight. Facing defeat, Janibeg ordered his engineers to use trebuchets, the great siege catapults of the medieval world, to hurl the corpses of plague victims over the walls of the city. The intent was clear. If his army could not take the city by force, the disease would take it for him. The Genoese merchants inside Caffa were horrified. They did what they could to remove the bodies, throwing them into the sea. But the damage was already done. The plague had entered the city, and when those merchants finally fled by ship across the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean, they carried the disease with them. Those were the ships that arrived in Messina in October of 1347. Janibeg's desperate act of despair had, quite accidentally, changed the course of human history. Before we follow the plague across Europe, it is worth pausing to understand exactly what the Black Death did to the human body, because to understand the fear it created, you first need to understand what it felt like to be in its path. The bacterium Yersinia pestis primarily caused 3 different forms of the disease, and all 3 were present during the Black Death pandemic. The most common was bubonic plague. When an infected flea bit a person, the bacteria entered the lymphatic system. Within days, the lymph nodes, particularly in the groin, the armpits, and the neck, would begin to swell dramatically, forming what medieval doctors called buboes. These could grow to the size of an apple. They were intensely painful. In some cases, they turned black and burst open. Other symptoms included raging fever, violent chills, headaches, vomiting, and a terrifying restlessness. If untreated, bubonic plague killed between 30 and 75% of those infected, usually within 3 to 5 days. The second form was pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs. This version was even more terrifying because it could spread directly from person to person through the air, through coughing and breathing. It was almost always fatal. Death could come within 24 hours, and it spread invisibly, silently, carried on the very breath of the dying. The third form was septicemic plague, an infection of the blood itself. It caused internal bleeding, the skin darkening and dying in patches. Those who contracted this form often died before the other symptoms had even fully developed. What made the Black Death so uniquely catastrophic was not just the lethality of any one form, but the fact that all 3 could be present simultaneously, reinforcing each other, moving through populations at different speeds and through different means of transmission. Medieval medicine had no framework to understand any of this. There were no microscopes, there were no germ theories, there were no antibiotics. Physicians at the time believed disease was caused by miasma, bad air rising from swamps and rotting matter. Some believed it was a punishment from God. A few came remarkably close to understanding that the disease was somehow contagious, and recommended keeping distance from the sick, isolating the ill, burning the clothing of the dead. These instincts were right, even if the reasoning behind them was wrong. But for most people, the plague arrived without warning, without explanation, and without mercy. From Sicily in the autumn of 1347, the plague moved with the speed of trade. It reached the port of Marseille in France by the end of 1347. It entered mainland Italy through Genoa and Venice. By the spring of 1348, it had consumed Florence, one of the richest and most culturally vibrant cities in the world. Florence lost roughly half of its population of 85,000 people. The streets were said to have been lined with the dead, the smell of decay hanging over the city for months. It was in Florence that the writer Giovanni Boccaccio witnessed the plague firsthand and recorded it in his famous work, the Decameron. He described bodies piling up in the streets faster than the living could bury them. He wrote of people abandoning their own children, of neighbors refusing to help neighbors, of the complete breakdown of the social bonds that hold a community together. His words survive to this day as one of the most vivid eyewitness accounts of mass death ever written. By the middle of 1348, the plague had reached Paris. The city was losing an estimated 800 people per day at its peak. It reached Bordeaux in France, Lyon, and crossed the English Channel to the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset in the summer of 1348. From there, it spread inland with terrifying speed, reaching London by the winter, killing roughly half the city's population. By 1350, it had reached Scotland, Scandinavia, and the Baltic states. The geography of the plague's spread was not perfectly uniform. Some cities, somehow, were spared or saw far lower death rates. Milan, in northern Italy, managed to contain the disease through aggressive quarantine measures ordered by its ruler, isolating infected households, burning the homes of the sick. The city survived with relatively light casualties. This was a remarkable early demonstration that isolation and containment could work, even without any understanding of the underlying biology. Other places were not so fortunate. In some rural villages, the death toll was so complete that the settlements were simply abandoned. Hundreds of so-called ghost villages across England and France empty of life within weeks, were never repopulated. They stand in the historical record as silent markers of what the Black Death took from the world. In total, by the time the first wave of the pandemic had run its course in roughly 1352, Europe had lost somewhere between a third and a half of its entire population. The population of Europe would not return to its pre-plague levels until approximately the year 1550, 2 centuries later. The sheer scale of the death toll did not just reduce the population of Europe, it shattered the structures that held medieval society together. The Catholic Church, which at that time was the central institution of European life, providing not just spiritual guidance but also education, healthcare, and social order, was devastated. Priests and monks died in enormous numbers, in part because their vocation required them to administer last rites to the dying, placing them in constant contact with the infected. Entire monasteries were wiped out. The church struggled to fill the void, ordaining new priests rapidly, with less training, less experience, and often less faith. The authority and credibility of the church, already under strain for other reasons, was dealt a blow from which it would not fully recover. The psychological impact was impossible to overstate. People in medieval Europe already lived with death as a constant companion, but the Black Death was different in its randomness, its speed, and its apparent indifference to virtue, wealth, or prayer. Entire families disappeared in days. Communities buried their dead in mass graves, without ceremony, without names. The art of the period reflects the trauma vividly. The dance macabre, or the dance of death, became a recurring artistic motif across Europe, depicting skeletal figures leading people of every rank, from kings and popes to merchants and beggars, toward the grave. Death, the art was saying, comes for everyone equally. This profound sense of mortality changed how people lived. Some embraced a desperate hedonism, feasting and celebrating while they could. Others turned to extreme religious devotion. A movement known as the Flagellants emerged, groups of men who traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in acts of extreme penitence, believing that by punishing their own flesh they could appease the wrath of God and stop the plague. They drew crowds in the thousands. Tragically, the Black Death also unleashed a wave of horrific violence against Jewish communities across Europe. With no scientific explanation available, many people sought a human cause, a group to blame. Accusations spread that Jewish people had deliberately poisoned the wells, causing the plague. These accusations were completely false. Jewish communities were in fact dying from the plague at similar rates to their Christian neighbors. Pope Clement VI issued a papal declaration stating clearly that Jewish people were not responsible for the plague and forbidding violence against them. The violence happened anyway. Hundreds of Jewish communities across Germany, France, and Switzerland were attacked and massacred. It was one of the worst outbreaks of anti-Semitic violence in medieval European history, driven entirely by fear, grief, and a desperate need to assign blame to something human rather than invisible. And yet, buried within all this horror was the beginning of profound social change. With so many people dead, labor became scarce. For the peasant farmers who had survived, this was, in a dark and paradoxical way, a form of power they had never possessed before. Lords and landowners who needed workers to farm their fields could no longer simply dictate terms. Peasants began demanding higher wages. They began leaving their traditional villages in search of better conditions. The rigid feudal hierarchy, in which peasants were essentially bound to the land and to the lords who owned it, began to crack. It would not crack overnight. There were peasant uprisings like the French Jacquerie of 1358 and the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 that were brutally suppressed, but the direction of change was clear. The Black Death had, in devastating the labor force, inadvertently given the poorest people in European society a form of economic leverage they had never held before. The slow grinding end of feudalism as a dominant economic system begins, arguably, with the mass death of the Black Death. The first great wave of the Black Death burned out across most of Europe by roughly 1352. But it did not disappear. It retreated, waited, and returned. Major outbreaks struck again in 1361, in 1369, in 1375, and at irregular intervals for the next 3 centuries. The plague returned to London with devastating force in 1665, killing roughly 100,000 people, nearly a quarter of the city's population. This outbreak, known as the Great Plague of London, ended the following year partly through natural attrition and partly because of the Great Fire of London in 1666, which destroyed vast swaths of the medieval city with its wooden buildings and its rat-infested alleyways. Gradually, human society learned to fight back, not through medicine, which remained largely powerless, but through public health measures. Quarantine stations were established at ports. The word quarantine itself comes from the Italian word for 40. Quarantina, after the Venetian practice of holding ships in harbor for 40 days before allowing their passengers to disembark. Infected households were sealed shut, their inhabitants isolated from the rest of the community. Trade routes were monitored and restricted during outbreaks. These measures were often brutal, often chaotic, and imperfectly applied. But they worked more than most people realized at the time. The frequency and severity of plague outbreaks gradually declined. The third and final Great Plague pandemic began in China in the 1860s and spread globally, reaching every continent by the early 1900s. This outbreak, which killed millions, particularly in India, was also the one that finally gave science the tools to understand what the Black Death had actually been. In 1894, the bacterium Yersinia pestis was identified, and the role of rats and fleas in its transmission was understood for the first time. Today, plague still exists. There are between 1,000 and 3,000 cases worldwide every year. But with antibiotics, it is now almost always survivable if treated quickly. The disease that once wiped out half of Europe can now be defeated with a course of medication. You might be thinking, this is a story from 7 centuries ago. Why does it still matter? The answer is that the Black Death is not a distant historical curiosity. It is, in very real ways, the origin story of the modern world. The end of feudalism, accelerated dramatically by the plague's destruction of the labor force, set in motion the economic and social changes that would eventually produce capitalism, the modern nation-state, and the concept of individual rights and freedoms. The weakening of the Church's authority helped clear the ground for the Protestant Reformation, which in turn reshaped the entire religious and political landscape of Western civilization. The trauma of the plague also changed how Europeans thought about life, death, and meaning. Some historians argue that the profound mortality anxiety of the post-plague period helped fuel the Renaissance, the great explosion of art, science, and humanist thought that began in Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries. When death can come for anyone at any time, the question of how to live a meaningful life becomes urgent in a way it had not been before. But the most immediate reason the Black Death still matters is the one most of us have lived through in our own lifetimes. In the winter of 2019 and 2020, a new infectious disease emerged in China and spread rapidly across the world. Flights grounded, borders closed, cities went into lockdown, hospitals were overwhelmed. The global economy shuddered. People were told to stay at home, to avoid others, to wear masks in public. The parallels with the Black Death are not exact, of course. The scale of modern medicine, the speed of vaccine development, the global communication networks that allowed scientists to share information in real time, these are things the people of 1347 could not have imagined. But some things were strikingly familiar. The confusion and fear in the early days of an unknown disease, the desperate search for someone to blame, the tension between those who took the threat seriously and those who refused to, the grief for the dead, the disruption of everyday life on a scale that felt incomprehensible. The realization, creeping slowly into public consciousness, that the world we thought we knew was more fragile than we had understood. The people of medieval Europe did not have the words pandemic, or quarantine in its modern sense, or social distancing. But they invented the practices. They figured out, through painful trial and error, that isolation worked, that distance mattered, that the movement of people and goods could carry invisible death across oceans and mountains and borders. Every public health system in the modern world, every quarantine protocol, every infectious disease control center, every global health monitoring organization exists in part because of what the Black Death taught humanity about the relationship between civilization and disease. We are, all of us, living in the long shadow of those ships that pulled into port in Messina in October 1347. The Black Death killed tens of millions of people. It broke civilizations, shattered faiths, and rewrote the rules of the world. But it also, in its terrible way, made us who we are. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe to Edge of History, a new chapter of the past, every week. See you in the next one.